which you spoke about a lot in the second group. But we're going to not want to be real about how the state of play is right now.
Yeah, so we need to make sure that people understand in this that we're not talking here about the manufacturing a state, but rather being honest about how resistive they actually are to be loving.
Because this is the magic.
Yes.
This is the magic part of what happens when we really long for truth and are really willing to allow the truth of how we feel and who we are and what our real desires are right now.
No matter how bad they seem.
No matter how much others might judge them or we might judge them, if we allow ourselves this deep honesty without action or anything else, just a deep willingness to know and feel how it is right now, that is the only way. And many of us here tried many other ways.
Yeah, this is one thing I'd like to ask you about. It just maybe mentioning some of your personal experiences with that. How obviously most people who come from the earth are still very addicted to gaining approval and gaining acceptance and doing things the right way without it really being a heartfelt motivation. So what personal experiences have you had in that regard when you were going through the progress on the path?
Yes. So as I think I've shared in our previous discussion, I came from a Christian background when I was on earth. And so and in some ways I feel exceptionally fortunate that I did have some purity or some understanding is perhaps the best way I could phrase it, some kind of real understanding of God while I was on earth.
Yeah.
However, I was within a Christian kind of culture, if you like. And as you know, there is a lot of emphasis on doing the right thing.
Moral behaviour, if you like.
Moral behaviour as defined by a certain set of doctrines.
Based on, or interpreted from Bible scripture.
Interpreted from the Bible.
Yeah.
And not necessarily, and certainly not in the church circles that I was in when I was on earth, on the heart-based state that would drive moral actions, even moral actions that are actually in harmony with God's way. And so I did have issues while I was on earth with a sense of self-denial where a feeling of shame about my own pleasure and feeling that, and by that I mean doing things that made me personally happy. I certainly
so more living a life of self-denial.
Self-denial.
Or self-sacrifice.
Yes, because I believed that was good and the right thing to do. And so a lot of my lessons have been, or that were initially when I entered the spirit world, were a lot about understanding that my desires for self-denial were actually a lot about avoidance of disapproval and some errors that I had about God and what it meant to be a good person. So I had to become pretty real about...
So when you became real about those things,
yes,
how did that feel like for you? What did it feel like for you? Because I suppose what I'm getting at is it seems that most people are so scared to sort of go through the reality of that for a lot of different reasons. And whatever it is that they need to face up with, like if it's a guy who's got different issues, or a girl who's got different issues, there's always issues that we either have some self-judgment about or judge others for and so forth.
Well,
and many of these issues come up in the process, but I suppose what I'm getting at is, how did it feel like for you when you first come face to face with them?
Very confronting. Very confronting. I felt that I was having to own up to being a bad person, that I was now not going to be lovable. I felt that the only way that I could be loved was to be a good person, and as defined by a certain set of rules that I had learned in a church environment while on earth, and having to come to face that I was not only a person who did actually, underneath some facade, have some personal desires that weren't involved in just serving others, felt to me very like I was having to admit I was a bad person, that I was selfish, and that I was therefore not worthy of good things or love. And I had almost a black and white feeling, like I was either very good or I was very bad. And acknowledging these things meant I was very bad, and therefore I would never
desire to even acknowledge them.
I didn't want to know them, and I felt that by acknowledging them and knowing that they were a part of me meant that they would never be out of me.
How were they made plain to you? Like, was it somebody else who was helping you come along and told you these particular things, or were there personal experiences that exposed them for you?
I suppose that the process started while I was still on Earth, where there was a growing dissatisfaction in certain areas of my life, where I didn't feel happy most of the time. But instead of pausing to examine why that was happening, or what might be the cause of that, I did more to try and avoid what, as I understand it now, God's laws were attempting to expose to me, what my conscience was trying to help me see. And so instead of kind of pausing to analyse the state of my life and analyse if my actions were good or bad, and how I was defining good and bad, and why I felt obsessed with defining good and bad. Instead of doing any of those things, I just did more and more of what I thought was good and tried to avoid more and more and suppress more and more of what I judged as bad. And so there was, by the time I hit middle age on Earth, I didn't feel that happy. But I didn't analyse that until after I passed.
So would it be right to say middle age on Earth, you also were quite resistive to self-analysis with regard to these areas that were causing you to be unhappy?
Absolutely. And this is, I raised that because I noticed that a lot of people on Earth, by the time they hit 40, they've almost become completely cut off to the idea of re-examining their ideas.
Everything in their life.
Everything in their life. There's a way to do things. This is how I do them.
This is their pet way because it gives them control, gives them power, gives them a sense of...
It helps them sleep at night in whatever way.
It makes their fear go away, basically.
Yes. And also they have quite a strong idea of this is what constitutes something that's good, this is what constitutes something that's bad, and I shall never analyse that again. This is the kind of person I am. This is how I've decided I am. I'm good at this, I'm bad at that. I'm good because of this, I'm bad because of that. And they don't ever consider, is this a correct analysis? What am I basing my analysis on? Sometimes you see on Earth people in their teens and their 20s and their 30s considering these things. But most people after the age of 40, 45 on Earth never think of those things again, and in fact become very, as you experience, very challenged
and rigid,
angry, rigid, whenever there is mention of stirring the pot, shaking the foundations of...
And it's unfortunate because in a lot of ways they don't realise that the very foundations they've built their life on basically are just the same or similar foundations to what their parents have built their life on.
Yes.
And there's no questioning of any of these foundations at all. And there's a lot of obviously societal pressure and other things as well, which they bow to in the process.
Yes.
Being brought up in a religious faith, you would have felt that too.
Absolutely.
So what I'm getting at now, okay, so we're now in the middle age, we're now quite resistive and we're quite rigid. How do we get from a stage where, my desire really at this point is really, I've got no faith really in God's goodness. I have got very little faith in my own ability to change. And on top of that, I have very little desire to know anything that I'm doing wrong because it just makes me feel worse about myself. And on top of that, I don't want to feel worse about myself ever. So I spend most of my life avoiding emotions or situations that might make me feel worse about myself. which then, of course, engages God's laws in such a way to cause me to actually attract a whole heap of events that make me feel worse about myself.
Yes. And so this is a great question. And beyond, so the first thing I would like to say about that is you need to ask that question. Exactly what you just said, that is the level of self-awareness that most people are resisting even having, to say, okay, here I am. This is how I feel when this guy talks about this stuff.
I feel angry and annoyed and shut down. I just want to zone out and I want to get right. I want to just tell him to shut up. Whatever it is that you feel.
Or, gosh, it's another thing. Or, oh, God,
no, here we
I don't
are
want to.
again.
Oh, well, I refuse to believe that about myself. What is he talking about? Or, that can't be right.
No.
Or all these sorts of feelings. And then to further analyse, but hang on. I'm not getting anywhere, or I'm not as passionate as I used to be.
I'm stuck in my life.
I'm stuck. I don't feel creative. I'm afraid to try new things. There's a level of dissatisfaction in my relationship that never seems to go away no matter what we do.
Yeah.
These kinds of questions, this is a part of truth.
So
yearning for truth.
Can we also say, though, that this is not just really truth, is it? Because humility is required in this self-examination. Yes. And so that brings me to the point of emotion. It's like most people seem to want to avoid truth because it helps them avoid negative emotion.
Yes.
And that seems to be the underlying reason why the majority of people don't want to grow.
Yes.
It's because it helps them avoid the underlying emotion, letting go of the underlying emotion, recognizing it, acknowledging it's there, and then even experiencing it. It helps them avoid all of those things.
And that's what I referred to in our introduction, which was truth is an emotional process. And so for us here, it's very difficult to pull apart emotion and truth and love,
but people on earth are doing this.
Exactly.
This is the problem, isn't it?
Because there is so much intellectual dominance upon the earth today, truth is viewed as almost as a clinical kind of in its own box.
Yeah.
Whereas once you reach a state of higher development and begin to interact with God, you understand that truth, it causes the flow of emotion, and the flow of emotion opens us up to truth.
Yes.
And that it becomes a cyclical thing. And if a person feels that they are receiving or hearing truth without there being a concurrent or subsequent or almost simultaneous flow of emotion, we can say that truth, there isn't a heart or soul opening to truth.
Correct. And that's probably what I'd like to sort of talk about a little more.
Yes, and that is really what I was referring to at the beginning of our discussion about the rattling of the foundations that must occur.
Yes. So there seems to be, with most of the people who are still attending our groups and even those who watch the videos and so forth, there's still not really a very strong desire even to acknowledge that unless you actually have felt something emotionally, you are yet to actually receive the truth.
And could we also say that if we are hearing a truth with our ears and there is an emotion that if we are not feeling a flow of emotion from hearing that truth, then there is some emotion that we are resisting, and most often there's anger.
Yes.
And that also is an emotion, and you spoke earlier about the development of a pure desire. Dealing with this anger and this almost hatred, we would have to call it a hatred of truth that we feel in most people. Dealing with that is the only way to begin to open up the flow of emotion, and which eventually leads to the development of a pure desire.
Yes. So really what we're saying is that if we examine the way the human soul works, which we've encouraged most of the listeners to go over a few more times, and my suggestion is still to go over that with the issues of preclusion and the other issues that you face inside of the soul. What we're really saying
wonderful discussions
is, if the emotion itself is still present within you of resistance, then unless that emotion disappears, you are going to continue to be resistant.
And that's wonderful. That is so, from our perspective, that is so wonderful, the simplicity of that, in that you need only deal with that emotion.
So let's look at resistance. Like you pointed out, resistance is really rage or anger, whether we express it passively or aggressively. Either way, it is just really rage or anger that is saying, I don't want to go there. Yes. Basically, that's what it is, isn't it? Now, if we're saying this resistance exists within us emotionally, we have reasons for its existence, is what we're basically saying.
Yes.
And unless a person releases those reasons for the resistance that exists within them, they will continue day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, even after they've passed in the spirit world. They will continue the same resistant process, all the while God's law is working against the resistance.
Yes. And could we add that the only way to discover the reasons for the resistance is emotional.
Is to feel the emotion.
Is to feel the top layer of resistance with a willingness or a desire to explore whatever comes up in that process. Because what we notice is people hear with their ear the truth that you just spoke, and then they say, oh, with their mind,
which is already
I just
wrong.
Heard something that I feel resistive to. I now must discover the reasons for the resistance, but they attempt it with their head.
And they don't realize this really simple process is, no, they're just angry about having heard what they've just heard.
Yes.
And all they've got to do is go through this anger and rage. They've got to let it be there instead of passively experiencing or not experiencing it or denying it. They've got to let it be there and realise it, feel it. Once they feel it, then they'll realise why it's there.
Yes.
But not before.
They have to. I have so many ideas of analogies, but like bust like a pimple, or just have a big vomit of. Just let it all. And I use those types of analogies because this is the level of judgment that people have of their own resistance. They think of it like vomit or pus or something putrid and yucky. And while anger is not a pleasant emotion, if we do own it sincerely in its expression, it is not harmful to others.
Exactly.
It is when people also hear with their ear the truth that you just said with their brain and say, oh, anger, I've got to just let the anger out. But their feeling is, my anger is someone else's problem and it's someone else's fault. And when we engage with anger and the expression of anger from that place, now we wish to harm others.
Yes.
And that is damaging to not only the other, but to ourselves.
And it further darkens our own condition.
Yes.
Even if it didn't cause any damage to anybody else.
But if we think about busting a pimple, or letting some off food come up and out of us.
Like a volcano erupting.
Yes. It's actually a relieving thing for the system for the pustulant or the infected thing to come up and out. And so it is not damaging to the system. And this is we don't need to analyse this analogy too much, but just to
relieves
give
the system.
It's a release. It's a release and a relief. When we try to attack with daggers another person with our anger, that is never relieving or releasing.
No,
it's a cyclical thing. It builds.
Well, it builds because we're also now causing more damage to ourselves, which causes more pain to ourselves, which we're then more angry about, and so forth and so forth. And if we're not careful, we can enter states of murderous rage if we're not careful.
Yes, very true. And And so going back to your point, which was to develop the pure desire to experience the reasons for the anger or the resistance, this must all be an emotional process.
Yes, so what we're basically saying is that the majority of people who come along to the group, and as you say, that within the first presentation, usually you start noticing it happening, if not before they walk in the door even. And they're sitting down, as you start discussing, there's a lot of truth coming at them, and quite often every statement has a truth that they haven't yet accepted emotionally. Now, because of that, there's going to be a build-up of this pressure cooker type of feeling until such a point. Now, they have a choice now. They're either going to have to release this pressure cooker in order to hear anything, or they zone out. And what I notice when we're teaching at the groups is the majority of people, if not all people, just basically get to that point and then zone out. And
yes, and this is what we notice. We notice that they zone out at that point, and they zone right out for months at a time. And it is only recently, for some, that they begin to circle back around. But they've done a long, circuitous route through a lot of addictions, a lot of numbing, a lot of avoidance, to come back. And now, really, they still have to engage with the process, which they could have engaged at that initial
6
point.
months ago, 12 months ago.
When they were sitting in the room or first watching the video, to say, okay, what is it I'm resisting here, and what do I really feel about it? Because unless that is emotionally resolved and released and relieved, then the truth and the emotional process of receiving and absorbing and loving and embracing truth, it can't happen.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's important to probably emphasize is that unless you are actually feeling emotions as you're receiving truth, it's highly unlikely you are actually receiving truth. In fact, it's impossible for you to be receiving truth in that moment. All you're doing is hearing it. And as I said in the first century, quite frequently to people, they're hearing things, but they're not getting the sense of it in their heart. Nothing's hitting their heart, because it can't hit your heart unless you actually process the thing that opposes it hitting your heart, which in most cases, like you say, is rage or anger about having to receive that particular truth.
And so the purpose of this discussion is now not to shame anyone for this long, circuitous route of sedation and numbing and resistance. It is merely to say that there are other choices that can be made, and in fact, it is the initial judgment of the resistance that creates a lot of problems that could easily be resolved by simply acknowledging and experiencing the resistance.
Yes, and I suppose all we're trying to point out is that large amounts of time in our lives can be wasted, firstly. You know, where 6 to 12 months goes past and we've barely changed at all, if not at all. And then there's the other problems that are associated with it is usually when we hit this wall, which we have to get through at some stage in our future progression. When we hit this wall of resistance, which is this wall of anger and other things we have about law and about God and about people and about, there's all sorts of issues involved in it. But when we hit the wall, we have a very strong tendency to run away or ignore the wall again for long periods of time, only to find that down the track we hit the wall again. And in the end, you keep hitting the wall and you keep hitting the wall and you circle around and hit the wall. Every time we circle around and go out from this wall, we often engage more in our addictions and more in our unloving behaviour, which actually causes a bit of a degradation to our soul. And the trouble is that the next time we hit this wall, we're less likely to actually feel like we have any motivation to get through it. So we end up in this terrible cycle where eventually we develop very little or hardly any motivation, and we decide, I'm just going to give up and I'm going to live my life as it is now for the rest of my life for as long as I can do that.
Yes, and this is what we notice, sadly, in a number of the people who did attend the groups, which was that there was more confrontation possible. There was more, people were hearing with their ears a lot more things that challenged them emotionally. And because they had come up against some of these challenges previously, from an emotional perspective, I mean the challenge of the truth confronting some resistance within them, and they had not dealt with that, it felt more difficult, and it felt also that more was required to suppress the inner sort of turmoil that was created. And as you say, some people walked away and have engaged more addictive emotional and physical processes to try to overcome this problem. And what we wish to encourage people to do is just to let it all kind of feel uncomfortable as
or
much
even
as
go
possible.
further than that if they can, and let it all hang out there. Let all of that. There's so much judgment, is there, about on the planet about being in control? It seems to be, and a lot of the problem here is about this internal feeling of I've got to maintain control, in my life, in my emotion, with my emotion, and so forth.
And what we notice is that people are continually attempting to tell themselves a story of where they're at and how things are and what is happening. But because this is engaged very much in an intellectual way, in an attempt to maintain some sense of control to themselves, they are acting in opposition to a soul process that's attempting to challenge the story that they're comfortable with and to tell them more, for the soul to communicate more of really what is going on from an emotional perspective. And that process does feel, as you know, quite out of control at times until one gets used to this feeling of being soul-centric.
Yes, I feel like initially I do feel that for most people they're going to feel out of control, but the reality is in a very short period of time you start realising that, wow, your life is far more manageable this way than it was any other way.
And in fact, for the first time, you become the person in charge of your life.
Exactly.
Not a facade that's based on what is a perception of what other people would want, or how you will get power, or how you will get approval, or how you will get to avoid fear, or how you will get all these other things that are actually in opposition to the way that God created you and the way that the soul wishes to operate, which is to experience, not to manage experience. And so once we get to start to live in our soul, we begin to experience things continually, and we make wise choices for ourselves, for the people, and thus have less negative impact on the people around us. We actually begin to experience a sense of satisfaction that comes from living in harmony with God's laws, not with trying to manage and control, a sort of counterfeit, sort of fleeting sense of satisfaction, which is really just the maintenance of control, or a facade, or an image, or an addiction for a short period of time, for as long as we can manage it, and it takes a lot of effort. It's actually quite a free place to live when we come to live in our soul and our emotions in harmony with God's laws.
So in terms of longing for truth, humility obviously is a huge factor in this, isn't it?
It is.
And it seems that for many of us, we find humility so difficult, and yet it's one of these, well, in fact, it's probably something that we even need to develop before faith will develop to a large degree, because a lot of faith will come only in time after we've released the opposing emotions, whereas humility is something that just says, wow, I've got so many opposing emotions within me to truth, and I've really just got to surrender to each of these emotions and let them all go, so that I can even absorb some truth And we've got to stop telling ourselves, which is also a lack of humility, stop telling ourselves that we're hearing truth when we're not feeling it. And we need to start seeing that if we're not really feeling every single truth hit our soul, and it's not having an impact in our day-to-day life, if our life isn't changing daily, then that's a strong indication that we haven't actually heard the truth at all.
Yes, and that was something that we wanted to mention also. You mentioned also about how does one come to really face the resistance they have to truth, the emotional resistance they have to it. And also our question is, how does one come to want to engage with this emotional process continually and to desire this confrontation to happen all of the time?
Understanding that it is the fastest way to progress.
Yes. And so this is what we see as lacking in a lot of people because this faith is not developed. But what you just mentioned is what we wanted to encourage people towards, which is to embrace this emotional confrontation as it occurs, and to allow this opening up of the resistance emotions. Sorry, I just...
Yeah, and also to sort of see it, isn't it, as if it's to see it that this is the way, like the way that God has made is to actually process through everything emotionally. That is the way. And if you're not processing everything emotionally, including every truth emotionally, then you're not on the way yet. And the key is that whatever other ways you were taught when you were younger, whatever other ways society says you should do it, and whatever other ways religion or people tell you should do it, you need to sort of almost give up all of that and go, no, God's way is the child's way, which is this very childlike, emotionally expressive process of releasing, going through emotional releasing every time you're confronted with the truth. And then the process will be fast and quite natural, and I'll notice big changes in my life when these things happen, and not be so worried about how it looks externally to everybody and how you are worried about how even worried you are about yourself while you're doing it.
Yes, and to engage, to basically to begin to live in the way that you just described, one must face the emotional opposition, the false beliefs, the false emotional beliefs that one has about that way of living.
Yeah.
Yes.
And these are inside of them. They're not external to them ever.
No. And it's very tempting to say, well, if I do that, then my neighbour will be like this to me, or those people will think that of me, or I won't be able to do this for my kids, or whatever it is, which is really putting the blame externally.
Exactly.
When really these are all ideas that we have within ourselves, and things that we are judging as either good or bad, and
or more importantly, things that we often have emotions that we don't want to feel associated with.
That's right. And it's all of these things are just emotions to experience.
Yeah. And this is, I see what a lot of the issue with of humility is this idea or concept that everything that we have to feel as we progress are just emotions. They're okay. You can feel them, It's like it's not a disaster to feel emotion, no matter which one it was. and there is this terrible thing on earth now, is it's like you see it a lot, particularly in Western societies, how somebody just even has a cry and they straight away feel they have to be medicated because
it's
they just need to have a cry.
It's a very sad state of affairs on the earth for us.
It is.
Because each time we see somebody crying in sincerity,
it's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
We understand that is them getting closer to living in the way that God intended, which is to be an experiencing emotional soul.
Yeah.
And so when people feel ashamed or they feel scared of their own emotional experience, which is very common, as you know, but it is the majority of people who are on Earth today, especially those above the age of 7 or 8, to feel afraid or ashamed of their own emotional experience. We see just the it's almost diametrically opposed to the way that the celestial heavens are constructed. The lifestyle on Earth compared to the lifestyle in the one-ment state, is almost diametrically opposed. And so we do understand that this is quite a state that people are having to overcome, to work through emotionally.
Yeah,
and
emotional belief systems that need to be given up, isn't there? There's no medication in the celestial heavens to stop you from feeling an emotion.
No, such things would never even be able to physically exist here.
Exactly.
Yes. Their construction and their design is not supported physically by the law that governs our spheres. So.
Yes, exactly.